Israel was not happy with the borders that were internationally recognized. So it always actively promoted its political mission of a greater Israel.
Dr. Yusuf, who had lived and worked in Gaza, said explicitly that the changes were always according to what the Muslim community would accept.
It showed us really who has control, and it showed us who can make the decisions about whether Muslims can access their own, their holy spaces or not.
Independence of security upon America? Why? I mean, I don't know if it's even peace that they're delivering, right? Do we not possess all the choke points?
It's important to remember that Jerusalem fell after years and years of disunity and short-term thinking and Muslims becoming accustomed to weakness.
Is normalisation restricted to the occupation of Palestine, or do we need to actually view it in a much broader context? Assalamu alaikum wa rahmatullahi wa barakatuhu, and welcome to another episode of Talking Point. I'm your host, Farhana. Before we get into it, don't forget to subscribe to the channel, share, like, and please leave your comments and your thoughts to help with the algorithm. So with me today, we have Dr. Amina and Zara. Assalamu alaikum to you both. So the situation regarding Al-Aqsa has been escalating for many, many decades now. And this past Ramadan, we saw its closure for over 40 days. The Zionist entity's attack on Iran was used as a cover to close the entire complex down. We also saw the issuing of the execution bill for Palestinian prisoners at the same time. And the response, quite frankly, was a deafening silence. Jordan, who many of you may know, are the supposed custodians of the Al-Aqsa compound. They actually sent out warnings that no protests were to take place for either of these developments. Anyone trying to protest would be facing immediate arrest. And on that Friday, following these warnings, there were police actively around the bigger masajid within Amman, dispersing crowds or any kind of gathering that looked suspicious. Ironically, after its reopening of Al-Aqsa, we then heard about the plans to convert the Al-Aqsa complex into a multi-faith center and simultaneously removing the custodianship from Jordan. Some might say, are we actually surprised by the fact that there was no action by Jordan? Unfortunately, people are not surprised. In fact, in a previous Palestine series, when we interviewed Dr. Yusuf, who had lived and worked in Gaza, said explicitly that the changes were always according to what the Muslim community would accept, and that the things that had happened in the 1980s, if we were to look back in the 1960s, they would have not been accepted. If we look at certain changes that then happened in the 2000s, in the 1990s, or the 1980s, people would have not accepted them either. So what we are seeing is that with time, the Muslims on the whole, international community as well, have come to accept more and more of these changes. She went on to say that if in 1967, if it had been possible to expel all Palestinians from the land without a reaction from the Muslim community, that they would have done it. But at that point, that was not possible. So what is happening and what we are seeing is getting people used to these changes so that more can then come. You can become more and more brazen and more confident in controlling populations' reactions, even if they're burning inside. And this has been proven from the reality, as there are violent attacks that we are seeing on a daily basis. The videos haven't stopped coming from the West Bank. Worshippers that were attacked in Ramadan is not something that was new. I remember the stun grenades that were used inside the masjid many years ago while worshippers were actively praying. Then you have the home demolitions. You have the expanding settlements, the arrest of the Imam of Al-Aqsa, Sheikh Ekrima Sabri. And all of this has been legitimized by the US and the introduction of the Abraham Accords. So to start off this discussion, let's start with Zara. My question to you, Zara, is this reality limited to Al-Aqsa, or does it represent something on a much more deeper level?
Yes, I mean, what is it that has brought us to this point? So most definitely, it does sit within a wider pattern. It is not an isolated issue where it's framed that this is a Palestinian cause or a Palestinian problem, where now we as Muslims need to raise the Palestinian flag and call for ceasefires and call for peace and call for, really restraining Israel in its mass slaughter and genocide, frankly speaking, of the Ummah. Now, the whole case of Palestine did not develop overnight. It started, as we all know, due to the designs of the British Empire more than 100 years ago in 1917, declaring that it will establish a Jewish homeland, making this idea of creating Israel as a dagger in the Muslim lands as a reality. So now, fast forward, what we've seen is that Israel, which too had declared independence in 1948, was not happy with the borders that were internationally recognized on the world stage. So it always actively promoted its political mission of a greater Israel. And that is exactly what we're seeing live on our screens happening today. But this kind of political and economic and geostrategic plans which are unfolding, the narrative that Israel under a security threat by its neighboring countries, that it's a really tiny country, it needs to secure its livelihood. All of this narrative, it's fighting terrorists, it's facing extremists, is what has allowed them to keep, annexing more and more land and creating so-called buffer zones, settlement, and also being propped up, supported by not just America, which has got a vital self-interest in this region, but also by the very regimes which were installed in these countries at the same time as Israel was created, which is the 1940s and the 1950s. So, of course, all those regimes also have a stake in why they should be supporting Israel and its survival in that region. So I would say the constant, steady incursions upon Muslim land and the shedding of Muslim blood has brought us to a point where we feel quite defeated and quite powerless. So our every other conversation with our fellow Muslims would be like, yes, but what can we do? So I guess, the wider pattern that we're talking about is not just the actual physical domination that we see unfold on a daily basis in our lands, but also the domination of our minds and the stunting of our thinking and ambitions, and how much we have come to accept the reality as something which is just our fate and destiny.
Yeah, I mean, I think that we accepted the reality previous to, what's happened in the last 2.5 years. And I think that the current situation has exposed so much of the world that we're living in. And the fact that we need to critically think now about our worldview. So, Amna, do you have anything to add to that?
Yeah, and I mean, just to pick up on the last thing that you said, and this is actually something that we were talking about previously, is that the fact that Al-Aqsa was closed is not, this is not a conversation about whether the gates were physically open or closed. It showed us really who has control, and it showed us who can make the decisions about whether Muslims can access their own, holy spaces or not. And actually, it was another indication of how normalized the humiliation of the Ummah has become. And again, it was a demonstration of the fact that when it comes to our responses as a Muslim Ummah, we've been trained in a way to respond to these, you call them catastrophes really, with statements and not actually physical action, and a reflection really of our spiritual condition, unfortunately. The example of the Strait of Hormuz, for instance, the response that the Ummah had when Iran was acting in a way that seemed to contravene the usual sort of servile behavior of Muslim states. The minute that the tensions rose and the Strait of Hormuz was cut off, the entire world reacted, and that was a tiny window into the possible power that the Muslim Ummah actually has. Because look, the Strait of Hormuz is not just a waterway, it's a global choke point, as they say. It's a place that facilitates a lot of the world's trade. And, the fact that Iran was able to create even a little bit of instability in the world for the time that they cut it off shows it was a glimpse into the power that actually the Muslim Ummah has if it is allowed to act. And really, when you connect these things together, these are not kind of isolated issues. This is, we're talking about kind of a whole regional architecture. But there's this network that we have over the last few decades where the Muslim lands, the wealth, the airspace, the ports, all of these are being co-opted to protect a world order that doesn't protect the Muslims and doesn't prevent the spilling of their blood. But interestingly, when it came to protecting these trade routes for the sake of the energy markets and Western strategic interests, suddenly everyone understands urgency. When there were threats of people's flights being cancelled or, running out of fuel, suddenly the urgency was there. And, all of a sudden there was all this diplomacy happening, strategic military planning, all of these, alliances that were being formed. But when Palestinians are being slaughtered in Gaza, and when Al-Aqsa is being sieged and raided, and when, people worshipping there are being attacked, suddenly, the caution is implemented and we're told, to wait. And then the language becomes around restraint and de-escalation and dialogue. So yeah, I think that just shows that the sort of current political world order doesn't prioritize Muslim blood. It prioritizes keeping the status quo and facilitating Western interests.
I just wanted to add on top of the regional strategy of division that you were talking about, that there is also a mindset within the Muslims, and this also affects the way in which that we view our relationship with each other. I mean, I don't even call them nation states. These are like colonies that have been created by the West, and then you're separated by these kind of arbitrary borders. What it means is that Muslim majority countries can be invaded, and we've seen this happen over the last 40 years or so. They can be invaded, they can be occupied, and neighboring Muslim nations can basically look on. Whereas actually in the last couple of months, what we've seen is the fact that when you are attacked, you can move to defend yourself. So my question is to you, Amna, is normalization restricted to the occupation of Palestine, or do we need to actually view it in a much broader context?
I think the problem though is people think normalization is just about like diplomatic relations. They think normalization just refers to, having embassies in a particular place or making trade deals or, making kind of agreements. And no, actually normalization is something that happens to make occupation more manageable. And it turns something that is basically a political crime that should have forceful intervention. It turns that into just a humanitarian crisis. So like that's what we're seeing now with the genocide. It's a political crime. It's something that should have a military intervention, and it's been turned into just a humanitarian crisis, as though it's like a drought or a natural disaster. And the problem is with normalization is that it affects the psyche of the Ummah as well. So it's creating a situation where the Ummah is being told to accept like basically humiliation as like this is now the reality, this is realism. And I think what ends up happening is we then internalize these limits to ourselves, and then we think, oh, nothing more can be done, and then we accept that protest is the ceiling, or charity, or calling for ceasefire. And also, we would accept, things like, for instance, the Al-Aqsa being restored after being closed, giving Muslims this temporary access to their own masjid, their own, holy site. That's not justice. It's not about whether the doors of Al-Aqsa are open today. It's about who's got the authority to decide to close them tomorrow. So that's why I think these small kind of like inconsequential things, I think we should be treating them as, an exposure, that the situation has actually exposed how weak the Ummah is and the hypocrisy of things like international law.
The question is that occupation, we see it as a very sort of definitive thing that we can witness. If we are witnessing the occupation of Palestine, this is something that is quite tangible. But actually, when you then start looking at the way in which that the Muslim world, specifically the Middle East, has been created, when you have the US providing security for certain Muslim countries, when you have US military bases scattered throughout the world, when you have economic pacts, what you are seeing now is that this concept of occupation is much broader, because one of the things that was exposed during this whole attack between the US, Iran, and the Zionist entity is that Iran was targeting US military bases in the heart of the Muslim world. A lot of people didn't know the way in which the Middle East functions. Sarah, would you like to comment on that?
That's such an important point to raise. Words such as occupation, territorial sovereignty, and nation-state independence came about, which we would call the post-colonial world order, right? And we have been educated that the era of colonialism and imperialism and empires, something which is a thing of the past. We've moved on, we've progressed, we've evolved. We know how to do governance well now. We call it, we're told it's called democracy, right? Where man is now intelligent and he's learned from his past mistakes, and therefore he has this entire system which is enforced. It's called the international world order. It comes in the form of exercising international law, which is pushed through international bodies. Basically means the Western powers, which is defined as the Anglo-American Empire. The United Nations being one of the key bodies, which we know have really made the Muslim countries quite dependent on trying to seek justice. These are infrastructures and these narratives and the entire world order was laid out to keep us occupied, right? Now, we can see how occupation doesn't only come in the form of bloodshed or in the form of, annexing land. It can come in the form where we are literally told to depend upon these international bodies in order to give ourselves security, in order to create economic progress, in order to create independence. I want to use the example of, Russia and Ukraine. So the way the framing of this war is done is that Russia, one sovereign state, is attacking another sovereign state, which is Ukraine. But in post-colonial world order, you cannot have expansionist ideas. You cannot have the sovereignty of one nation compromised just because of your own personal expansionist ideology. And the same is said about Iran. But funny enough, the whole occupation, whether you call it a military occupation or an economic occupation or a geopolitical occupation of the land of Asham, is not occupation. This is a moral army which is defending the security of a sovereign, democratic, secular state, and it has got full right to do this. So you can see how we are really plagued with all these different narratives. We have accepted that Pakistan is a so-called sovereign nation, but guess what? How can it be sovereign when it's the very source of its food, which is water, is in the hands of India? India holds the upstream parts of the Indus River water system. Jordan is dependent on Israel for its water. Syria now is dependent on Israel because Israel's got the Golan Heights. It's got the dams of the Mocha River and the Jordan River. It's got entire control over the upstream and the midstream part of these rivers. So every now and again, if Jordan is not being a slave enough to American diktats or Israeli diktats, then it would just threaten it of shutting the water. Egypt is dependent on Israel for about 60% of its gas. I mean, when did that happen? How did that happen? Today, Syria hosts, America, and it hosts all these AI companies and oil companies to come and make treaties, alliances, strategic partnerships. Again, these are terms that are fed to us to tell us our Muslim lands and countries are becoming sovereign, independent, economically progressive. Look, they are coming to the world stage and they are going to prosper. All we need to do is sit back and watch these economic deals unfold, watch CPEC unfold, BRICS unfold, watch Pakistan play an incredibly diplomatic role on the world stage in order to bring peace and stability in the Middle East by holding peace talks between America, Israel, and Iran. Hidden in all of this is more and more occupation of the resources which belong to Muslims. We're literally handing them over on a platter. And then to turn around and be surprised that we are going to be, handled as puppets every time anything goes against the wishes of the Anglo-American Empire is quite baffling to me. Oman was threatened by Trump that America would blow up Oman if it has an economic deal with Iran to monitor and provide the access to the ships going through the Strait of Hormuz, and that Iran and Oman are going to basically kind of make money out of it. But Trump was not happy with that because that would mean that Oman and Iran would have some sort of leverage over this choke point. So immediately Oman, what did it do? It said, yeah, we're going to be on the side of America because look, America's threatened us. So what kind of sovereign post-colonial world order are we talking about when these countries, these small client nation states can be swayed with one threat, right?
I think there is this idea about the myth of the post-colonial independence, but there's also a choice that regimes have made. Sometimes people will say, well, there was no choice in the matter, that we had to make these pacts or we had to secure these deals. However, as you said, that there is enough leverage that exists for Muslim countries to use effectively in order to, it's all about bringing the US down to its knees, but at least you can hold your own. And I think this is where it's quite contradictory to what I want to bring up next about internal paralysis. And what I mean by internal paralysis is that this is like a symptom that comes from normalization that we kind of started talking about at the beginning. And this is more about what internal paralysis that exists within many of the Muslim lands. People use these boiling the frog analogy or carbon monoxide poisoning. So if you were to look at the example of Egypt, which has a population of 120 million, it's absolutely huge. Yet in the last few years, we haven't seen any mass protests. And if you think about it, you've got European streets that are churning out 300,000, 400,000, 500,000, right? I think some of them even reached 1 million at some point as well. You have people, non-Muslims, Muslims, who are trying to put pressure on their government's criminality when it comes to what happened in Palestine. Are we saying now, if you now compare the streets of Europe and the streets of the Muslim world, are we saying that a few 100,000 in Europe have more concern and more care than the 120 million in a Muslim majority country? And the question is that if Egypt had the same freedom to move like Europeans, how would that look? If you look at Jordan, it's around 60% Palestinian. Something very odd is going on here. Amna, would you like to comment on that?
Yeah, so I kind of wanted to touch upon the kind of perceived passivity of the Middle East and North Africa region or the Arab world. And I would say actually that question itself can sometimes reveal, I guess, how little we understand about the reality of people that live in those countries. And we kind of have to distinguish between apathy and suppression because these are not the same. So when we're speaking about Egypt and Jordan, we're not talking about populations that have no attachment to Palestine or Al-Aqsa, because this is not the case. These are people who are brothers. And we know that both of these nations or societies have produced, scholars, activists, or normal people who've sacrificed immensely for the cause of Palestine. So the issue is not that there's a lack of concern. The issue is that the concern exists under a system that has spent, decades disciplining, monitoring, punishing any kind of political expression. And we know, for example, in Egypt alone, that, the massive culture of imprisoning, disappearing people. Thousands and thousands of people have been, detained or surveilled or had travel bans or intimidated in some way. And, entire generations in these countries have grown up seeing what happens if someone publicly challenges the state. So, and this, I say it's a very similar reality in Jordan as well. Jordan often is actually portrayed as a more stable nation in comparison to some of the other Arab countries, and also that is the custodian of Al-Aqsa. But we've seen time and time again that there have been restrictions on like political mobilization, especially when it comes to Palestine. And again, similarly, people being arrested, people being silenced, warnings against having demonstrations. And then you end up with this reality where people are expected to kind of emotionally support Palestine, but not in any political way that would challenge the status quo. So yes, I think this and even for example, high profile people being arrested, scholars for example who speak too openly will find themselves imprisoned. And I think that's why the carbon monoxide analogy is so powerful here, because it doesn't kill immediately. It slowly deprives your body of oxygen in a way that you don't even notice what's happening. You become tired, and then you become confused, and then you can't think clearly, and then eventually the faculties that you would need to alert you to danger stop functioning properly. And I would say that the suppression of the Ummah has worked in a very similar way. Every generation that's witnessing torture, imprisonment, disappearances, censorship, people begin to internalize these limitations and then kind of police themselves. And I think that's maybe in a way the most dangerous form of control that the Ummah is facing. It's the political environment that allows that emotion to be translated into some kind of action?
From what you've said, there's even more reason why I feel very strongly about this, why we in the diaspora have way more responsibility to speak and raise these issues comprehensively. As you know, we're not in the same boat. I saw a clip of a young Egyptian brother going around asking people in his hometown in Europe what they know about Egypt. He then asked them, do you know about the prisons that exist in Egypt? About the corruption and how everything that has been said in terms of tourism and pyramids and all of this stuff has basically been used to whitewash, what is the reality in Egypt for normal people. So he was trying to expose the reality of regimes and also the way in which that Western governments support and give aid to. So I think Egypt is the second largest recipient of aid after the Israeli state, and that says a lot. So moving on, us now living in the West, whether on an individual level or on a collective level, we have an overwhelming presence. Many of us are now second, third, fourth generation Muslims. Many of us are no longer economic migrants or fleeing war zones, okay? We have become educated, we have businesses, we have set up dawah organizations. Many of these organizations have become, mainstream. They're even expanding their presence across borders. And also we have access now to so much information. Now, in terms of political representation within governments of European countries, within the corridors of the UN, we are in huge numbers globally. There has been a strategy where people would say that when we get enough power, when we get enough representation, when we are able to infiltrate certain areas and industries, that's when we're going to be able to become stronger, wealthier, and that's when we're going to be able to bring about change. But actually what we are seeing is the opposite. Instead, we've witnessed a live streamed G-side, and we couldn't even bring a bottle of water into Gaza. We've openly admitted this. Some would say we've become more cemented in preserving our lives in the West.
Let me come in here. So you mentioned that, we've kind of, as an Ummah, we've sort of got to a point where we recognize that we have a lot at our disposal. We have some of the most strategic kind of areas of land. We have nuclear powers. We have control of important trade routes, and more than that, Muslims sit in parliaments, in governments, in universities, and corporations across the world. But we always find ourselves asking the same question after every single act of violence or massacre or occupation or every humiliation that we suffer. What can we do? And the problem with that question as well is that there's a difference between possessing power and exercising power. I think Muslims possess power, but they don't exercise power. So something's obviously gone wrong in the space between those two things. And in the last couple of years, we've seen so much action being taken by Muslims and non-Muslims in the West and beyond, such as, the rapid growth of the BDS movement, the millions of people marching, every week on some of the streets of Western countries, people calling for ceasefire, all these Muslim charities raising money, mobilization of these aid organizations, even I would go so far as to say people embracing Islam in growing numbers after witnessing the steadfastness of the people of Gaza. So all of this all of these are indications that the Muslim Ummah at least, and also even I'd say a proportion of the non-Muslims, are emotionally very, very much alive. So you have to kind of ask yourself, why is it that we've got these numbers but we don't have direction? Like I said, we have capable armies, we possess weapons, we've got large populations, but none of these have actually translated into protection of Al-Aqsa or the protection of the lives of the Muslims. And really one of the biggest problems is not that there's no resources, is that there's no independent political will in amongst the Muslim leaders. And so whenever Muslims try to have these conversations and discuss, political independence through an Islamic lens, you have to pay attention to what happens. Calls for revival are often scrutinized, or political unity is labeled as something that's unrealistic or unachievable. Islamic leadership is often branded as something dangerous or something that needs to be monitored. And the responsibility of the Muslim armies is treated as like a taboo topic, something you can't even really discuss. But I think Muslims we're encouraged to care deeply about what's happening to the Ummah in Palestine and beyond, but we're discouraged from talking about the political structures that cause these problems in the first place.
So this kind of narrative creates a different type of servitude in our mindsets, where we start looking up to the very structures of oppression, this obscure and very selective freedom of speech, like how many of the elderly non-Muslim women and men themselves have been dragged off into prisons just because all they say is that they want the genocide to stop, right? The second important thing is that when was the last time we went to a talk or heard something which gave us an actual real life, a vision of what statesmanship in Islam looks like, leadership in Islam looks like? What does flexing your hard power and soft power in an independent way looks like, right? The regimes in Muslim lands and the borders are two of the biggest obstacles to restore the authority of Islam. And Israel has exposed that America is it's dependent on these regimes, on the basis that it's created over the decades in our lands. The treaties and the alliances and the partnerships it's created, the data centers which feed the AI programs of where the targets are come from a Muslim land. So what did Iran do? One of the first things it did is that it took out the data centers in Saudi, in UAE, because there is no security for the populations across the Muslim lands. It's a very, very delicate state. Dependence of security upon America. Why? I mean, I don't know if it's even peace that they're delivering, right? It's more like security of their regimes, right? Why is the military security in the hands of the Anglo-American empire? Do we not possess all the choke points? Like when Iran shut the Strait of Hormuz, there was projections of how it's going to take us many decades back. Now imagine the Strait of Malacca being in Muslim control. We have the Suez Canal, which is in Egyptian control. Bab el-Mandab Strait, which is in our control. We've got the Strait of Istanbul, the Bosphorus, Straits of Tiran, the Khyber Pass, Sumet Pipeline, which is the Suez and the Mediterranean pipeline alternative to the Suez Canal. So why do the regimes need security and economic prosperity from the American empire? Like, truly is the other way around, right? And of course, none of the Muslims like these regimes. These regimes have been imposed upon us. So of course they need security. And of course, they're going to hand over anything which can remotely give any sort of geopolitical and economic power to the masses, because for them, they would not have existed if it was not for the post-colonial superpower.
Okay, so the political situation of today is, we know that it's not unique to us. I think there's been a lot of conversations about this, that this is not the first time that Al-Aqsa has been occupied. And this is where people talk about Salah ad-Din and the political dilemma that he faced and had to deal with. And there is a lot of analysis in the process of how he went about liberating Al-Aqsa. And one of the things that we see is that he worked tirelessly to correct the public opinion and the mindset of the Muslims. And actually that draws a lot of parallels for us today. That even though Salah ad-Din lived at a time under the Islamic political authority, the Crusaders also sought to create security deals, pacts, military occupation in the same way in which, the West have securitized the Muslim world. So they are relying on the aspirations of individuals who are willing to set aside this, whether you want to call it the Ummahtic cause or the Ummahtic vision or unification for their own power. And quite honestly, working to liberate Al-Quds is considered to be something of an inconvenience for some. Even the Palestinian issue or the Palestinians is an inconvenience for these regimes. Can you give us some insight, Amina, into how Al-Aqsa was taken then in the first place?
I think often we think that these situations that we're encountering in the current day haven't been repetitions of what's happened historically. And I mean, we know that the Ummah has encountered very similar kind of reality during the Crusades, when the Crusaders entered Jerusalem. The real tragedy wasn't just the brutality of the invaders, the same way that the real tragedy in Gaza right now is not the brutality of the Zionist entity occupying force. It's important to remember that Jerusalem didn't fall in a single day. It fell after years and years of disunity and short-term thinking and Muslims becoming accustomed to weakness. So the occupation was actually more of a symptom of the underlying problem, the disease that had appeared a long time ago. So that's why I think the story of Imam al-Harawi is so powerful, because after Jerusalem fell to the Crusaders, the survivors had basically fled across the Muslim world with the news of this catastrophe that Jerusalem is now in the hands of the Crusaders. But many Muslims carried on with life as normal. The rulers continued to govern, the people continued to fast and worship, but Al-Aqsa remained occupied. And Al-Harawi traveled to Baghdad to try to shake the Ummah from its sleep. And when people heard about what he was doing, they were kind of outraged by his actions. And he replied essentially saying, your outrage towards me is greater than your outrage towards the occupation of Jerusalem. And so he understood actually what we should understand now, that the Muslims had become accustomed to something which is completely abnormal. They had normalized disaster, that we've become psychologically comfortable with occupation and with oppression as well.
You've obviously brought up some really important points. The scholars who are the leaders in their own right to speak the truth are either martyred or in dungeons. We know this. But also has been responsible for depoliticizing the Ummah's issue. I came from the don't talk about politics in the masjid generation. Yeah. And I've now seen that we've done a complete 180 degrees on that. But what we are seeing is a redefining of political activism in our communities. And quite disappointingly, outsourcing our politics and our thinking to other ideologies. So when Sheikh Didu, who's a very respected scholar, or the Sheikh from Yemen, or many international scholars have said during the last 2.5 years that the one who abandoned Gaza are the rulers and the armies, it's actually falling on deaf ears, because we have become politically deficient in terms of in our thinking. And the corrupt elites actually have no interest. There was no reaction to these few scholars that actually exposed what the root of the issue is. And the other thing is that we don't look at Palestine and then let everything else burn, i.e. there's the occupation of Kashmir, there's the occupation of East Turkestan. So the compass has to be Islam. Islam is the one that directs us into, where our activism and where our concerns should be. When you look at the destruction of Syria, the genocide of the Rohingya, I've seen on social media platforms where people will say that in all intents and purposes that Palestinian lives are more valuable than Syrian lives, okay? Or pro-Palestine activism in Bangladesh. But then within that, you will see very extremely derogatory comments that are being made to the Rohingya. Or in Pakistan, again, a lot of pro-Palestine, support. But what about next door with Kashmir, okay? So how do we develop political thinking, and what are our sources for this thinking? I know that it's Islam, but actually that sounds very vague, because when we say, capitalist thinking or communist thinking or socialist thinking, these are sort of well-defined ideologies that we are very familiar with. When we start saying Islamic political thinking or Islamic thinking, actually immediately, where does the mind go to? Oh, giving charity, being good to your neighbors, being kind, all of it's valid. However, it's not constrained to just those values. It's a comprehensive project. Ara, what would you say about this this issue that we have when it comes to the way in which our thinking has been, potentially outsourced, and how do we get it back?
So politics is simply, solving problems, right? Making policies in order to solve an issue. What we see is that there are more and more policies are made in order to make life really difficult for the majority of the global population. Everything is suffering. Islam already drew red lines for us, showed what political leadership looks like, what a functioning state looks like, what should be its priorities. One of the very key priorities was the honor of the women, blood of a human being, right? A whole tribe was expelled because one Muslim woman was harassed in the market. An entire battle was launched, the Battle of Mu'tah, because one person's blood was shed. So if only we were to look at Islamic sources to see what the red lines are. What is haqq and batil? What we see today happening in Gaza and those people standing up, they reflect the mindset that we're meant to have. But unfortunately, the majority of the Muslim mindset has been colonized. There's two aspects to this. One could be a very passive mindset, right? Where we feel so fatalistic that we say, we have no power, we really can't do anything about it apart from dua and send some charity if you can afford it. And the other is the pragmatic colonized mindset, where we're still told that we're going to have to pressure this world order, pressure the system, tweak it, trick it, mold it, throw money at it to win their favor. What are we doing with our zakah? Sending it off to Muslim lands? No. We need to fix the politics here so that it can affect the politics in the Muslim lands. Therefore, we have to curry their favor, right? They don't call it bribes, they call it lobbying, okay? Because it's worked pretty well for AIPAC. Now, what's happening here? What's happening is that we have totally outsourced our political thinking, our understanding of how to bring change for the Ummah in the Muslim lands. We've outsourced it to the existing power structures. We need to have more Muslim voices. And now it's not even about Muslim voices, it's about voices of justice in the corridors of power. We need to have more humane people who have a track record of fighting for human rights. Well, Keir Starmer has a track record of that. He was a human rights lawyer, right? David Lammy, I guess, he too. So there's numerous examples of how these people with their human rights morality entered into the system. Yeah. So forget about political unity. Let's talk about unity on who we should be voting for next independent candidate. Yeah, let's strategize and be politically aware and unified upon this, because somehow it's going to have some sort of a trickle effect in the Muslim lands, and then ultimately we'll play the long game and it's going to all unfold. Did we not get told that about Turkey? I mean, how long did I hear that Turkey's playing the long game? But guess what? Trump comes out saying that Erdogan is his really good ally and strategic partner, and Turkey might have joined forces with Iran. But Trump said no. And Erdogan, what did he do? He said, yes, sir. All he needed is one phone call, right? So this is what's happening. So this type of pragmatic, let's tweak the system, let's play the long game, without any sort of understanding of what the Islamic vision is obviously going to bring us to the very feet of the empire that we claim we're fighting.
Yeah, so I think this conversation is really about this idea that we're politically active and we're empowered and represented, when actually in reality the boundaries of our political participation have already been drawn for us. And I think it's not just about one politician or one personality. It's more to do with how Muslims, or how quickly Muslims can be pressured into accepting this political narrative that's written by somebody else. So the current status quo is that if you support a particular Muslim public figure, then you're considered to be, strategic and politically engaged and a mature thinker. But if you question the framework, if you question the limits of, electoral politics and whether representation inside a secular system can actually really deliver liberation for the Ummah, then you're labeled, someone extreme, unrealistic, or divisive. So to be honest, even our political imagination is policed under this system. It gets to define our priorities, who our leaders are, what counts as success, even things like what counts as extremism, what's acceptable grief and acceptable resistance and acceptable anger. All of this has been laid out for us. And the crazy thing is, after defining the entire field of play, they then invite us to participate and call it empowerment. So that's really what the ruse is. And the problem is that the Muslim diaspora in particular, who are living in the West, have been trained to mistake having access for power. So what I mean by that is, becoming MPs, for example, becoming mayors or ministers. These people have access, but they don't automatically have power. So a Muslim in a high office is not automatically, someone who's going to drive forward victory for the Ummah. You have to really question what framework are they operating within, and what red lines are they forced to obey? What can they say? What can't they say? What can they not challenge? Whose interests are they ultimately protecting? Because really, we've seen many examples of this. A Muslim representative in these sort of Western governments can condemn individual suffering, but they can't challenge the political order that's producing the suffering. So then what actually are we achieving by having, or by aspiring to have these kind of powers? This just ends up becoming a symbolic victory rather than actual power.
Yeah, I think there's also this confusion as well that Islam and politics don't go together. This was something that was actually solidified. Now, when you are now coming into an arena where actually it's very politicized and there is a surge of activism, you are now going to start looking for ideas. No politics in Islam creates a vacuum. And so then what actually fills that vacuum is colonial thinking, a pragmatic thinking. Now, whether that's going to be how the liberal West function, how they function, or how socialists are looking at the world, or whatever it is, that vacuum is going to get filled by something. So I want to go back to what we talked about earlier, which was about the great post-colonial myth of sovereignty and freedoms, the trick which the Ummah fell for. It's not just about the celebration of national holidays and flags, but it's the fact that we don't see this as celebrating our division, our weakness, our colonization. And our mindset, again, or our worldview is continuously being shaped through colonization. And this has played a huge part in how we are still confined and constrained within the colonial orbits of its ideas, its political actions, and, who do we go to? This is something that was explicitly said by the Canadian Prime Minister and Lindsey Graham. That international law, or ICJ or ICC, these structures were not in place for the West. They were there to monitor and to punish the global South.
Era of great power rivalry is fading, that the strong can do what they can and the weak must suffer what they must. There is a strong tendency for countries to go along to get along, to accommodate, to avoid trouble, to hope that compliance will buy safety. Well, it won't. In 1978, the Czech dissident Václav Havel asked a simple question: how did the communist system sustain itself? And his answer began with the greengrocer. Every morning, this shopkeeper places a sign in his window: "Workers of the world unite." He doesn't believe it. No one does. But he places a sign anyway to avoid trouble, to signal compliance, to get along. And because every shopkeeper on every street does the same, the system persists. Not through violence alone, but through the participation of ordinary people in rituals they privately know to be false. The system's power comes not from its truth, but from everyone's willingness to perform as if it were true. And its fragility comes from the same source. When even one person stops performing, the illusion begins to crack. Friends, it is time for companies and countries to take their signs down. For decades, countries like Canada prospered under what we called the rules-based international order. We joined its institutions, we praised its principles, we benefited from its predictability. And because of that, we could pursue values-based foreign policies under its protection. We knew the story of the international rules-based order was partially false, that the strongest would exempt themselves when convenient, that trade rules were enforced asymmetrically. And we knew that international law applied with varying rigor depending on the identity of the accused or the victim. This fiction was useful, and American hegemony in particular helped provide public goods, open sea lanes, a stable financial system, collective security, and support for frameworks for resolving disputes. So we placed the sign in the window. We participated in the rituals, and we largely avoided calling out the gaps between rhetoric and reality. This bargain no longer works. Let me be direct. We are in the midst of a rupture, not a transition. Great powers have begun using economic integration as weapons, tariffs as leverage, financial infrastructure as coercion, supply chains as vulnerabilities to be exploited. You cannot live within the lie of mutual benefit through integration when integration becomes the source of your subordination. The very architecture of collective problem solving are under threat.
Contrary to what we're told, America works along with the European states, with the UN, with international law, with the international bodies. But what has unfolded in Afghanistan, in Iraq? How many stories about Abu Ghraib, Guantanamo Bay, propping up dictators and despots? Trump is a bad apple. Remove Trump. Seriously, the situation was never good under Biden or under Obama or under Bush, under John Major, under Tony Blair. What does it mean to live in a system which is driven by certain creedal ideas? Capitalism is an entire system. It protects, it implements, it propagates. Trump is going to be gone tomorrow. Just by populating our structures with the Ilhan Omars and the Rashida Tlaibs and the Mamdanis, would the world be different?
You're right. There does seem to be this obsession about, representation, redefining political activism, wanting economic prosperity and engaging in, like humanitarian efforts, all of, without actually questioning what these all mean. So when you're looking at European nations, when they entered the caliphate system, it was actually to break us from within. And this is how they are still functioning. But actually, this is not the way of Muslims. There is no underhanded secret plot to take over the West. I just want to make this clear for anybody who thinks that. At the same time, we also don't want Muslims that are entering Western political systems to then fall into their corruption, or to look up to them as, valid ideas that we need to start adopting either. And then you're going to find a fatwa that then puts a rubber stamp on it. So this all comes back to the sort of last part of the discussion, which is vision and obligation, and the steps that are needed to overcome the obstacles to work towards this vision. We've talked about the fact that Al-Aqsa is a reflection of the condition of the Ummah, spiritually, geopolitically, economically. The problem with leadership, nationalism, no protection, and the lack of injustice, as well as the physical division of our lands. And we know this is a direct consequence of the no politics in Islam mantra, as well as the deep-rooted colonial and pragmatic thinking that is becoming more and more prevalent now. How do we start restoring these issues as an obligation and a long-term vision? Amna.
You asked a question about what the vision is, and I think that's a very important question to kind of end on, because I think what we need to remember is that Al-Aqsa is a mirror, and it forces us to ask the question, what kind of world are we as Muslims meant to build? What kind of civilization are we supposed to carry, and what kind of justice are we meant to deliver? And also, what happens to humanity when the Ummah loses sight of that mission? And I just want to illustrate this with the point about going back to Jerusalem under the Crusaders. So when Jerusalem was liberated, 8 days after the liberation by Salahuddin al-Ayyubi, and this was on the 4th of Sha'ban in 83, the year 583 after Hijrah, the first Jum'ah Salah was prayed in Masjid al-Aqsa in over 100 years. So just want to kind of reflect on that, because for over a century, Al-Aqsa had been under the Crusader occupation. Salah had not been prayed and the adhan had been absent. And generations of Muslims had lived and died while Jerusalem remained occupied. And then when Allah subhanahu wa ta'ala returned it to the hands of the Muslims, the first Jum'ah wasn't treated as like a military parade, or like a moment of personal glory or some kind of nationalist celebration. It was understood as a trust. And Qadi Muhyiddin ibn Azaki stood and delivered the khutbah, received glad tidings of the pleasure of Allah, which is the ultimate goal and highest status, because of which Allah has brought about at your hands the regaining of this lost land. He didn't say receive glad tidings because your tribe has won or your nation has expanded. He tied the liberation of Al-Quds to the pleasure of Allah subhanahu wa ta'ala. And that's the difference between kind of Islamic liberation and a nationalist conquest. So going back to the point about nationalism, it's about restoring justice and sanctity and worship under the authority of Allah subhanahu wa ta'ala. And I want to also mention that this is where the civilizational legacy of Islam in Al-Quds is important, because when Muslims ruled Jerusalem, they didn't just possess the land, they built a whole society around it, so that included the schools, the masajid, the lodges for the travelers and worshippers. There were systems of charity and public service, and there were qadis to settle disputes. There was a whole system and structure in place. It was governance, law, public welfare, accountability, and the protection of the life, wealth, and honor, and to actually serve the people. And I think that's maybe the vision that we've lost. Is when we speak about Islamic political authority today, people are scared of it. They're taught only to think about punishment or authoritarianism. But actually, historically, the authority of Islam was meant to be something that represents justice and creates order, and and something that protects the weak.
Okay. So what kind of liberation is it that we're talking about today?
It's important to, I guess, define what we mean by liberation. So liberation in the context of everything we've been speaking about isn't having temporary access to Al-Aqsa by the same people that can then close it again tomorrow. And it's not having a ceasefire that then leaves the occupation and these compromised Muslim regimes completely intact. And it also means that we no longer expect that the oppressed people will be expected to defend themselves while the Ummah watches on. Liberation really means that justice is restored through establishing leadership and unity rooted in Islam. And really, actually, probably the most fundamental bit of this is freeing the Muslim mind from the belief that we're powerless. Because before we can actually liberate a land physically, we need to liberate the Ummah from this dependency on external forces and limitations. And Al-Aqsa is not something that's going to only be liberated through the Ummah. It has to be liberated by Allah's permission through an Ummah that understands that it has a responsibility and restores its vision and prepares itself to carry justice again, as it did during the time of Salahuddin Ayyubi.
The last few years have really opened the eyes of so many to the gems that exist in our Ummah and the immense sacrifice from ordinary people, the martyrs, or the murabitun, the women that gather in Al-Quds daily for the Salah, the journalists martyred, or the scholars who are living in literal dungeons for speaking the truth, or even the celebratory videos of happiness and solidarity with, Muslim football teams in the World Cup, or the child in Gaza who was pulled out from under the rubble shouting, Fida Al-Aqsa, sacrifice for Al-Aqsa. These sacrifices and sentiments should not be seen as rhetoric, but actually a different mindset that exists in the Ummah, especially people who are on the receiving end of imperialism, capitalism, US hegemony. And I think it's really important for us, the diaspora, many who are benefiting and living in privileged positions in the West, to speak freely, for us to recognize that the issue of the Ummah is not just one of charity or to connect with our roots, but it's a political one. And that the obstacles that we've discussed, whether nationalism, fracture of lands, regimes, the mindset, they have all been constructed in the minds of the Muslims and constructed physically to keep us politically disunited. Political unity is by no means an end to our problems or a solution. Salahuddin is a prime example of having a political authority, but no leadership. But it was an obligation. And that's what motivated him. That's what fueled the likes of him and the community that he belonged to. And for him to be able to identify the factors that were obstacles in the physical liberation of Al-Aqsa. One of them being that Allah sets us the obligations that we need to fulfill, not what we think they should be. As a parent, myself, I've told myself many times, don't expect the like of Salahuddin to be born from a generation when we are giving contradicting messages. What are our aspirations for our children? Are we preparing them to sacrifice some comfort for the sake of obligation? Or are we just building a conveyor belt for more material success because it's not haram to be wealthy? It's not haram to be wealthy, but that's not the point. Have we understood that as a basic idea that there is no way that you can occupy Kashmir unless Pakistan has bought into the idea of borders, nationalism? And when that doesn't work, fear, arresting, any kind of dissent. The same model is replicated throughout the whole region. Do we not question that the destruction of Syria was allowed to happen because its neighboring countries sat and did nothing? That southern Lebanon has been now handed over to the occupation after the indiscriminate bombing campaign and ethnic cleansing of that area. So liberation of Palestine is very much intrinsically linked to the liberation of the region first. And exposing these obstacles and this reality is an obligation and a responsibility of all of us.